Jard never imagined that a simple job offer could upend his life. But the day a long-eared, pearl-skinned stranger stepped into his asteroid, his quiet world erupted into the galaxy's most unexpected, chaotic, and delightfully strange adventure. Jard had never considered himself the type to perform acts of interstellar charity, mostly because he had a well-established routine of barely surviving the monotony of asteroid life, punctuated by the occasional misadventure with malfunctioning cleaning bots or gravity-defying kitchen utensils. His asteroid, a small, jagged rock floating lazily in the outer rim of the Seldari cluster, was more cluttered than cozy, with stacks of unused tech gadgets, scattered maintenance tools, and a suspicious number of expired nutrient packs that hummed faintly whenever he passed. He liked it that way, mostly, because chaos required little effort to maintain, and he could convince himself that he was an eccentric genius rather than someone perpetually avoiding tidiness. That is, until the marketplace incident. He had been trudging through the crowded aisles of the Seldari orbital bazaar, dodging cargo drones carrying everything from interdimensional cheeses to containers of fermented asteroid jelly, when he first saw her. She was crouched on the floor beside a bin of moldy rations, her delicate hands sifting through scraps as though searching for some hidden treasure that only she could perceive. Her skin glimmered with a pale luminescence, almost like pearl dust caught in starlight, and her long ears twitched nervously, flicking toward every passerby as if recording a symphony of potential threats. Jard had never been a generous man, not in the heroic sense of the word, but something about the combination of her vulnerability and her absurdly precise concentration made him pause. "Hey," he said awkwardly, stepping closer and tripping over the strap of his own gravity boots, nearly face-planting into a stack of floating containers. "Do you need a hand?" She froze for a moment, then slowly straightened, brushing off a thin layer of space dust. Her eyes, large and oddly human in shape, but with a depth that made Jard's chest tighten for reasons he couldn't quite identify, met his. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to decode whether his gesture was genuine or just another form of galactic sarcasm. Then, after a pause that felt far longer than it probably was, she nodded ever so slightly, an almost imperceptible lift of her lips forming a tentative smile. Jard hesitated, suddenly aware that he had no plan, no idea what he could even offer her. "I mean, I could, give you a job, cleaning. It's not glamorous, but there's food included, usually. Sometimes." He gestured vaguely toward his cluttered asteroid home, hoping the gesture would communicate more than his fumbling words ever could. Her response was a quiet, melodic chuckle that sounded like wind chimes shaken by a gentle solar breeze. She inclined her head with a precision that suggested both amusement and curiosity, as though weighing the absurdity of the offer against some internal scale only she could understand. Then she said a word in her native tongue, a soft, lilting syllable that made Jard's stomach twist in confusion and delight. "Okay," he interpreted it, possibly incorrectly, but the tone was affirmative enough that he decided to take it at face value. The first day was, predictably, chaotic. She moved through his asteroid like a strange, elegant storm, vacuuming around gravity nodes while muttering under her breath about floor spirits that apparently existed only in her culture. Jard nearly collided with a floating mop on several occasions, once executing a perfect somersault to avoid being swept into a vat of simmering nutrient soup. The alien woman hummed to herself as she worked, the melody oddly infectious, and Jard found himself grinning at the spectacle of her long ears flicking in rhythm with her movements. At one point, she paused to observe a pile of discarded gadgets, poking them with a finger and then shaking her head as if they had personally offended her aesthetic sensibilities. "You know," Jard said, "some of those are broken." She looked at him with mock horror, tilting her head so far that he feared her ears might tangle in the floating wires. "Broken?" she echoed, and he realized she wasn't upset. She was amused, possibly scandalized by the very notion. By the time the first meal arrived, Jard noticed something unexpected. She had rearranged the kitchen. All the nutrient packs were sorted by luminosity, the cooking utensils aligned at precise angles, and a small hydroponic tray he had forgotten existed now held a tiny garden of bioluminescent herbs. She beamed at him with a flourish that was almost theatrical. "I've made it better," she announced, her pronunciation carrying a musical cadence that made Jard laugh despite himself. Better was a generous term. The herb tray threatened to topple over, and one of the floating utensils had developed a minor orbit around the ceiling light, but he couldn't find it in himself to care. There was something in the pride of her accomplishment, the heartfelt, unrestrained joy in small acts, that was contagious. Over the next week, the asteroid settled into a rhythm of sorts, punctuated by minor disasters and intermittent humor. She had a habit of attempting human culinary experiments, resulting in edible objects that occasionally fizzed, glowed, or emitted pleasant smoke rings that spelled out alien runes. Jard discovered he had developed a tolerance for oddities he never imagined. A sponge that sang operatic notes when wet, a mop that occasionally levitated toward him as if eager for applause, and the occasional hovering teacup that refused to land until bribed with a piece of synthetic sugar. Each day, he observed more of her cultural nuances, subtle gestures that conveyed respect, tiny rituals performed before touching objects, and a delicate way of moving that suggested she carried unseen weights of memory and emotion. Despite the chaos, humor became the invisible thread binding their days. She had a way of delivering playful mockery without offense, like placing his gravity boots in the fridge and pretending they were perishable, or sticking a warning tag on his favorite mug that read, "Contains liquid dangerous to human egos." Jard laughed until he was out of breath on more than one occasion, realizing that the presence of this long-eared alien woman had transformed mundane chores into something far more delightful. Her gratitude was evident in every gesture, every meticulously cleaned surface, every playful joke. It wasn't just politeness. It was a deep, intrinsic acknowledgement of being seen and valued, and Jard felt it echo in his own chest in ways he didn't fully understand. Even late at night, when the asteroid was quiet and only the hum of energy panels and distant stars broke the silence, he would catch glimpses of her still awake, arranging objects or quietly humming melodies into the gravity-cushioned air. Once, he peeked into the kitchen to find her teaching one of his cleaning bots to dance along to her song, the little droid wobbling precariously before spinning in perfect, if accidental, synchronization. Jard sat back in the gravity lounge chair, marveling at the absurdity of it all. Who had thought that hiring a stranger to clean would result in a full-scale, miniature cosmic performance in one's home? By the end of her first week, he realized something astonishing. He hadn't just hired an alien woman to scrub floors and organize nutrient packs. He had unwittingly invited someone extraordinary into his life, someone whose presence made the asteroid brighter, the chores lighter, and the universe just a little less lonely. The humor, the unexpected creativity, the quirks of her long ears and delicate expressions, and the uncontainable warmth of her gratitude had transformed his small corner of the galaxy into a place where laughter could coexist with stardust. And kindness had begun to echo in ways that even the cold, distant stars seemed to notice. And somehow, between floating teacups, singing mops, and herbs that glowed like tiny supernovas, Jard understood that this was only the beginning. The galaxy had just delivered him a cosmic paradox, someone who could both unbalance his life entirely, and yet, through sheer joy and gratitude, make him feel more balanced than he had ever been. The asteroid, once a lonely jumble of wires and dust, had become a stage for a partnership he hadn't known he needed. One where humor, humility, and interstellar kindness collided in improbable, delightful ways, leaving him wondering which of them was truly teaching the other how to live. The second week on the asteroid began with a minor explosion, not the kind that made the walls shake or alarms blare, though that would come later, but a quiet, glittering puff of alien powder that coated the ceiling like the aftermath of a miniature nebula. Jard stumbled into the kitchen just in time to see her twirling in the gravity lift corridor, long ears flicking like twin comets, and her hands gesturing wildly at the floating mess. "I thought it needed sparkle," she explained with a perfectly innocent tilt of her head, as if the concept of cleaning could ever justify boring beige. Jard blinked, wondering if interstellar cleaning really came with a clause for art installation. The dust settled on his shoulders, on the kitchen table, and even on the hovering teacup that had begun its own orbit around the gravity core. He laughed, a full, unrestrained laugh that ricocheted off the metal walls, and realized he was slowly losing the last of his former obsession with strict order. Meals became a theater of alien creativity. She had discovered the spice synthesizer and decided that the recipe for human comfort food needed both color and occasional mild combustion. A simple bowl of nutrient stew might arrive at the table glowing faintly green, fizzing quietly, and releasing tiny sparks that made the gravity sensors chirp with polite alarm. Jard had learned to duck quickly, sometimes managing to sip the soup before it hopped onto the ceiling tiles. She would watch his reactions with a mixture of curiosity and glee, flicking her long ears in rhythm with the popping noises, occasionally humming a triumphant tune. "It's not dangerous. Much," she reassured him, even as a tiny explosion sent a floating herb leaf spinning across the lounge. "Mostly flavor enhancement," she added, tilting her head like a conductor listening to an orchestra that included at least 3 semi-sentient cleaning bots. Their interactions were punctuated with a slow, accumulating series of inside jokes. She had a peculiar habit of attaching tiny labels to objects. One might read asterisk, dangerous to humans with poor reflexes, on a floating spice jar. Another might say, do not touch. May spontaneously dance on his gravity boots. Jard found himself laughing before he even registered the danger, caught somewhere between admiration for her whimsical sense of humor and fear for his personal safety. Once, she tethered a mop to the ceiling so that it slowly descended in a graceful arc whenever he entered the lounge, spinning like a ballerina performing solely for his amusement. He considered complaining, but instead let it spin, thinking that perhaps the universe had finally gifted him some absurd form of companionship he had never realized he needed. Beyond humor, she revealed unexpected depth. Her long ears, expressive and sensitive, would flick in response to sounds that Jard could barely detect. The low hum of a failing power converter, the almost imperceptible squeak of a floating container, even the distant chatter of passing cargo ships through the thin hull. She would pause mid-clean, listen intently, and then gesture with precision that seemed rehearsed by instinct rather than instruction, subtly rearranging items to optimize both function and safety. Jard noticed she treated each object as if it had personality. A chipped mug received a gentle bow before being washed. A malfunctioning cleaning bot got a reprimanding hum, and even the teacup that insisted on floating toward him was occasionally scolded with mock severity. In her world, mundane chores became acts of ceremony, and gratitude transformed into a quiet, pervasive presence. One afternoon, a supply drone arrived with a delivery of experimental interstellar desserts. She examined each item with the solemnity of a galactic judge, and then embarked on a series of culinary experiments that defied both physics and taste. Nutrient cubes fused with bioluminescent algae, hovering teapots conducted tiny arcs of static electricity over pudding, and one gelatinous sphere bounced around the gravity field until it embedded itself halfway into the ceiling panel. Jard dodged, cursing politely, while she clapped her hands in delight. "It's alive!" she proclaimed, and he had to admit, with a mixture of fear and amusement, that the wobbling dessert seemed to be considering its own orbit with surprising determination. Through it all, the asteroid took on a rhythm that was uniquely theirs. Gravity fields were adjusted to encourage playful bouncing. Ceilings became arenas for floating herbs and teacups, and music, her alien hums, the whir of cleaning bots, and occasional human laughter, filled every corridor. Jard found himself looking forward to the small absurdities. The occasional geyser of fizzing soup, the mop ballet, the careful rearrangement of tools with unspoken elegance. He realized he was learning her language without words, decoding the patterns of her gratitude, the tiny rituals that expressed care, and the subtle humor that softened even the oddest moments. Despite the levity, she carried traces of her past, glimpses of memory and longing that surfaced in quiet moments. A discarded piece of equipment would be arranged in a particular way that suggested respect, or she would pause to hum softly to a tool that no longer functioned. Jard watched these gestures with increasing fascination, recognizing that each act of cleaning, each playful prank, each melodic hum, was part of a larger, intricate expression of her culture, her life, and the gratitude that seemed to radiate from her very being. Even the long ears, which at first seemed purely aesthetic, were instruments of perception, recording subtleties in the environment that Jard had never considered. The faint change in air pressure as a maintenance bot passed, the micro vibrations in the floor tiles, the tiny shifts in lighting that made certain objects shimmer. She absorbed the asteroid, its quirks, and its chaos, and transformed it into something more than a home. It became a stage for her personality, her humor, and her immense, overflowing gratitude. By the fourth day, Jard discovered a new pattern. She was teaching him, through humor and practice, how to live in a space that was both absurd and beautiful. Objects were no longer merely functional. They had narrative, character, and intention. The floating spice jars weren't hazards, they were dancers. The malfunctioning cleaning bots weren't nuisances, they were performers in a cosmic ballet. Even his own mistakes became part of the entertainment. Each misstep met with a soft, musical giggle that made him feel simultaneously exasperated and strangely appreciated. He began to anticipate her subtle pranks, waiting for the teacup to orbit him, or the mop to descend like a pendulum, and he laughed each time, not out of habit, but because the universe had finally given him a companion who transformed chaos into joy. One evening, while adjusting the gravity fields to accommodate her latest culinary creation, an experimental dish that hovered, glowed, and hummed softly in 3 distinct pitches, Jard paused and realized how much he had changed. He no longer rushed through tasks. He paused to notice the flicker of her ears, the alignment of floating utensils, the cadence of her hums. He no longer simply endured the absurdities of asteroid life. He delighted in them. The humor that infused every corner of the asteroid, from fizzing soups to singing mops, became a lens through which he viewed the galaxy, one where kindness and gratitude could transform even the most chaotic environments into spaces of unexpected beauty and connection. Her gratitude, though, was never performative. It appeared in the smallest gestures, a careful folding of his garments, the rearrangement of his tools to maximize both utility and aesthetics, a hum that lingered in the gravity fields long after she had moved on. Jard noticed it in the way she looked at him sometimes, not with expectation, not with obligation, but with genuine acknowledgement, a recognition that transcended language and species. Humor had softened the edges, laughter had bridged the gaps, but gratitude was the core, radiating through every act, every small chaos, and every experiment that fizzed, glowed, or levitated unpredictably across the asteroid. By the end of the second week, Jard knew the asteroid had transformed. It was no longer a cluttered, dusty rock floating on the edge of the Seldari cluster. It was a playground, a laboratory, a stage, and a home. Humor, gratitude, and interstellar curiosity had converged to create something richer than mere habitation, a miniature universe in which every object, every song, every flick of long alien ears mattered. And as she hummed softly while arranging a new floating display of bioluminescent herbs, Jard realized, with a mixture of awe and amusement, that he had become not just an observer but an active participant in her intricate choreography of gratitude, playfulness, and life. It was absurd. It was chaotic. It was utterly, irreversibly delightful. And somewhere in the constellation of lights beyond the asteroid, Jard suspected the stars themselves were twinkling a little brighter, caught up in the sheer joy of 2 beings, one human, one long-eared alien, learning, laughing, and discovering the boundless humor and warmth that kindness could inspire in the strangest corners of the galaxy. The asteroid seemed almost alive that morning, though perhaps that was just Jard's imagination, colored by weeks of floating teacups, fizzing soups, and the quiet, pervasive hum of her presence. The alien woman was already at work, long ears twitching with precise attention as she floated between gravity nodes, dusting the edges of the observation dome where starlight streamed in like liquid silver. Jard watched her for a moment, leaning against the wall with his morning nutrient shake in hand, marveling at how she had transformed not just his home, but his perception of it and himself. The asteroid no longer felt like a cluttered jumble of metal and circuits. It had become a stage, a laboratory of delight and curiosity, a miniature cosmos where every floating object and every small act of care mattered. Today, however, promised something different. There was a tension in the air, not the suffocating, alarm-triggering kind, but the subtle anticipation of a climax, the sense that weeks of humor, chaos, and shared absurdity had been quietly building toward a moment neither of them could yet define. She hummed a soft tune as she adjusted the orbit of a hovering herb tray, occasionally flicking one of her long ears to redirect a floating teacup that had developed a mind of its own. Jard shook his head, laughing quietly. The teacup was clearly sentient, or at least mischievous enough to qualify. "One day," he muttered to himself, "I'll get a cup that doesn't plot against me." As he moved through the gravity lift corridor, he noticed the subtle ways she had prepared the asteroid for a small, unspoken celebration. Tiny bioluminescent lights glimmered along the edges of the walls, arranged not randomly, but in patterns that resembled constellations he recognized. Ones from the outer rim of the Seldari cluster, where he had spent lonely nights staring at distant stars. Floating containers were aligned as though waiting for a cue, and even the malfunctioning cleaning bots seemed to pause in respectful anticipation, bobbing gently as if aware that something remarkable was about to happen. She caught sight of him and grinned, ears flicking in amusement. "Good morning," she said in her melodic tone, which carried an undertone of mischief. "Today is special." Jard raised an eyebrow. "Special? Is that code for don't touch anything or the gravity field will implode?" She tilted her head, humming thoughtfully. "Not exactly, but you will see." For the next few hours, the asteroid became a stage for her vision, a culmination of everything they had shared. She led him through the corridors, pointing out subtle adjustments. A spice container that now hovered in perfect rhythm with a distant melody, a mop that descended only when gravity permitted, and a display of floating herbs forming a miniature galaxy. Each detail was infused with humor, yet each also carried an undercurrent of meaning, gratitude, connection, and a reminder of how far they had both come. At the heart of the asteroid, in the observation dome where starlight pooled like liquid metal, she gestured to a holographic display she had prepared. The projection shimmered, forming images of both their lives over the past weeks. Jard tripping over gravity boots, her experimenting with luminous soups, floating teacups spinning in mock rebellion, and every small, joyful interaction they had shared. Jard's laughter bubbled up, uncontrollable, as he watched himself being depicted with exaggerated clumsiness and theatrical flair. She tilted her head, long ears flicking, and added a floating teacup in the hologram that winked at him. "You did all this for me?" he asked, astonished. "For us," she corrected gently, though with a playful glint. "Not just for you, for all the connections." Her words were simple, but the weight behind them resonated through the gravity-altered room. Connections, gratitude, humor, they had all intertwined to create something larger than the sum of their days. He realized then how much he had changed. Jard, who had once existed in a state of practical monotony, who had navigated life with the minimum effort necessary, had become someone who noticed subtleties, appreciated small absurdities, and laughed freely in a way he hadn't remembered since childhood. He had learned to see not just objects, but the stories they could tell, the life they could contain, and the ways humor could transform even the most mundane corners of the galaxy. He had discovered patience, attentiveness, and a quiet delight in acts of care that transcended species, space, and expectations. The day progressed with a series of playful experiments, each highlighting her ingenuity and his willingness to embrace unpredictability. Nutrient cubes now danced along carefully mapped orbits, emitting faint glows that mirrored distant nebulas. A malfunctioning cleaning bot attempted a pirouette, wobbling dangerously before stabilizing in a triumphant pose that elicited laughter from both of them. Even the teacups, ever mischievous, had coordinated a small aerial ballet above the observation deck, their tiny orbits synchronized with the flicker of bioluminescent herbs. Eventually, they paused, leaning against the edge of the dome to watch the cluster of stars beyond the asteroid. She hummed softly, ears flicking in rhythm with her song, and Jard found himself feeling a profound sense of gratitude, not just for her, but for the lessons she had imparted through humor, care, and relentless curiosity. He realized that the asteroid, chaotic and absurd though it remained, had become a home not because of order or efficiency, but because of the interplay of laughter, kindness, and shared experience. "Thank you," he said quietly, surprising himself with the sincerity of the words. She glanced at him, expression unreadable for a heartbeat, then smiled, a smile that conveyed relief, warmth, and amusement all at once. "For what?" she asked lightly, though her tone carried layers of meaning. "For showing me how to live," he replied. "Even in chaos, even in floating teacups and fizzing soups, even here." Her ears twitched in acknowledgement, a gesture that somehow felt equivalent to a bow, and she hummed softly, leaning closer. Then, mission accomplished. They spent the remainder of the day in quiet companionship, moving among floating objects and softly glowing herbs, sharing jokes and experimenting with minor gravity anomalies. The asteroid, which had once been a mere survival station, now felt like a living entity, a canvas for humor, creativity, and gratitude. Even the malfunctioning cleaning bots had adopted a rhythm that suggested contentment, bobbing gently as if fully aware of their role in this cosmic tableau. As the stars outside deepened into the velvety black of space, punctuated by glimmering constellations, Jard understood something fundamental. Life was not defined solely by survival, efficiency, or routine. It was defined by connection, by laughter, by small acts of care, and by the courage to embrace absurdity and joy wherever they might appear. She had arrived as a struggling alien seeking work. She had transformed his life into something richer, lighter, and immeasurably more delightful. By nightfall, the asteroid hummed with quiet energy. Floating herbs glimmered faintly, teacups continued their playful orbits, and the cleaning bots drifted lazily in gentle arcs, their lights pulsing in synchronized rhythm. Jard and the alien woman leaned against the observation dome, watching distant ships drift past and the constellation of stars blink knowingly. Humor had softened the edges of chaos, gratitude had imbued every gesture, and through it all, a profound bond had taken root, a bond that transcended species, expectations, and even the vast distances of space. The final act was simple yet perfect. She handed him a tiny, floating, holographic star, a miniature replica of the cluster where he had first found her. "For remembrance," she said softly, "of all the little things." Jard held it, gravity nodes adjusting to accommodate its delicate weight, and nodded. "I'll remember, and not just the stars," he replied, a grin tugging at his lips as he watched her ears twitch with amusement. In that moment, amidst levitating objects, bioluminescent herbs, and the gentle hum of the asteroid alive with shared life, he realized that the galaxy had given him something far greater than he could have imagined. A teacher of gratitude disguised as a cleaner, a companion of uncontainable humor, and a reminder that the universe, for all its chaos and unpredictability, could create bonds as bright and enduring as the stars themselves. The asteroid had been transformed, yes, but so had he. And as they watched the starlight ripple across the metal and glass of their home, both human and long-eared alien knew that this chapter, full of laughter, chaos, gratitude, and connection, was complete, leaving space for whatever adventures awaited next, secure in the knowledge that humor, kindness, and shared delight would guide them through whatever the galaxy might throw their way.